This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covell. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Garrett Nyman. He is the author of a book, a quite controversial title, Rich White Men. Yes, we jump right into it today. An interesting conversation covering lots of territory, food for thought from many different angles. I tell Garrett in the beginning, this is probably the most controversial book that I've read to bring onto this podcast. But hey, I respected the individual that connected us together, and I said, gosh, let's give it a shot. Let's see what happens. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my conversation with Garrett Nyman. Garrett, I got to tell you, with your background, Stanford, Harvard, I don't know the exact names, and I'm not trying to go down that path, but I'm sure I've had professors on this show from both of those universities that you may have had as teachers or professors. It's been a really interesting podcast that I've done for so long. Started off as trading primarily, but now clearly I talk to everybody. I'm kind of like Joe Rogan light in terms of more variety. I think I've really ended up having a lot of academic conversations with so many professors on this podcast. But I will have to say, and I've so many different books over the years since 2012, I'm going to guess, I think it was because of a mutual connection. And I figured, well, there's some trust there, so I'll just jump into the deep end. But I'm going to guess your title for your newest book is probably the most controversial title that I've had on this podcast. Let me just read the title. You'll probably get half the audience agreeing and half the audience disagreeing immediately, right? You already know this.
Yep.
The title, Rich White Men, What It Takes to Uproot the Old Boys Club and Transform America. That's a controversial title. And let me also say, I do know from your background that one of the big goals that you are pursuing, if not the biggest, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that one of the biggest goals you're pursuing is federal reparations for Black Americans.
Yeah.
With that title and with that goal, how do you walk into this subject when you know it's so polarizing?
It's a very challenging subject, and frankly, in my view, the reason so few people walk into it is because of exactly what you're saying. In many ways, this project is an attempt to wade into territory that's challenging. I hope I do that successfully, but also this is relatively uncharted, nascent territory. The idea of driving progress from a place of advantage and power is not a field that's developed the way medicine is, for example, that it really is more of an art than a science. What I've tried to do through the past 15 years of my career is build bridges across differences, everything from high poverty communities of color to corner offices and boardrooms of wealthy white men. This book is an attempt to try to bridge some pretty vast differences that, as you know, are challenging.
I think the most interesting thing about the main title, Rich White Men, is, okay, you and I just chatted on video for a second, and I know I fit the definition of men, but I don't necessarily know, and if I missed it in your work, you can kick me in the butt. I want to understand specifically the term rich as you see it. Is it a number definition or is it something more? Because it's the first word. Obviously, it was a very important choice that you made to use that word.
Part of the critique of the book is this notion that the way we define rich in mainstream American culture is actually obscenely rich. What does it look like to look at rich through the eyes of the oppressed? For me, for example, the first time I identified as rich was when I learned that for Black and Indigenous families in the United States, the top 1% for those families is just over $1 million in wealth. Most Black and Indigenous families have basically no wealth. If I look at my upbringing, which was in a affluent, mostly white suburb in Orange County, California, through the eyes of those who have had no wealth in this country for generations. Those of us like me who grew up in wealthy suburbs with strong community resources, also people like me who had access to some degree of intergenerational wealth. From the eyes of the oppressed, that is rich. One of the reasons why I'm interested in redefining rich is that what I found is that basically every person I talk to who's wealthy defines rich as richer than they are. I've talked to someone with a $300 million foundation who talks about his little foundation and how it's so small compared to the big ones. I've talked to billionaires who talk about how they don't have as much money as Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, and there's only so much they can do. And if you go on the Gates Foundation website, one of the things Bill Gates says himself is that he doesn't have as much money as some countries. There's this tendency to say that rich is richer than whatever I am. I want to shift that notion to there really is a sense that a much greater number of people might be defined as rich if we look at rich differently.
Let me sharpen the blade here a little bit to try and get some specifics. You mentioned a couple different types of individuals, someone worth 300 million, or talking about Bill Gates. I mean, we're talking about the less than 1%. I mean, this is somebody over, 50 million, 100 million, the billionaires. This is quite different than, let's say, the dentist who's making 150K a year. But that would be the vast majority of people. So when you define rich, do you use a number at all?
In the book, I don't name a specific number. The way I've generally thought about it is that if you want a clean number I could give you is those who are multimillionaires, those who hold $2 million in wealth. Those are folks who can generate a six-figure income, which is much higher than the American average without working at all, assuming they get a modest 5% return on their money. That would be one example of a concrete figure I could give you to define rich that is perhaps different than it's often described in mainstream American society.
Fair enough. You've put a number out there. No need to really drill on that. We could have debates. First off, there could be people, obviously, I'm guessing at least 50% of America unilaterally disagrees with you before the conversation even starts. But if you're going to get into the conversation, then, okay, people are going to have disagreements about numbers. Let me go ahead and bring up a subject which I think you might have some perspective on, and maybe it's going to be controversial. Maybe there's going to be disagreement. I've noticed in the last handful of years that, of course, with the George Floyd situation, tragic death, there was a tremendous amount of media coverage for that situation. But if I look at a situation that happened recently with the young man that was killed in Memphis by 5 or 6 police, I noticed there was almost no coverage. The reason I bring this issue up is I think, and you know this, when you come into a topic like you've walked into, people start to look for inconsistencies. They start to look for messaging. They start to look for who is behind a particular message. How is it unfolding? And I find the way that media brings up all of these topics that you've jumped into the middle of, I can't find any consistency. That makes a lot of people probably feel like, if you come onto my podcast, a lot of people probably feel like, oh man, and I don't know exactly what you're going to say, but how do you feel about the messaging part of America when it comes to race right now?
It's a good question. And I think one of the things that's so challenging with the bubbles we have is that certain portions of the population are literally hearing different media, different facts, different information. That's one of the reasons, obviously, why it's so hard to talk to each other, is that it really is a different fact base. Even statistics can be deployed in a certain way, or certain statistics can be prioritized and so forth. That's all a really challenging thing. The main thing that I feel like is missing from the mainstream discourse in the media is this notion that many of the problems that our society is focused on would be dramatically reduced or maybe even go away entirely if this country were finally willing to take a stand on wealth inequality. For example, in San Francisco, there's so much concern and frustration about poverty and homelessness and theft and a number of different things. In San Francisco, someone like Larry Page, founder of Google, he has enough wealth to endow a fund that would provide $100,000 a year in income in perpetuity to all of the families who currently live in poverty in San Francisco, and he'd have $30 billion left over. Marcus Aurelius said that poverty is the mother of crime and revolution, and there's a lot of truth to that. I don't want to say that taking on wealth inequality or poverty would entirely eliminate some of these issues like crime and policing and so forth. But I do think it's worth a shot to see what actually happens when we address some of these root causes in a very direct way. I feel pretty confident that we would really move the needle on really the need for policing as it's currently defined.
You brought up a lot of different issues there. The Larry Page example is interesting. I'm not going to say I agree or disagree per se, but it's a much interesting conversation to talk about one man who can almost take care of a homeless problem or a crime problem in one particular city because, like you said, it's so many billions versus bringing that number down to the person that's making 2 million, because there's a lot of people making 2 million. You make a couple mistakes, you can go through $2 million really fast in America, especially in the current economic climate right now where people are over leveraged and this and that. So it is an interesting point that you make about Larry Page. And then when I contrast it with the lower figure they brought up, let me ask though a little bit further on the point, because you did bring it up in your work. Do you find any incongruity, any disconnect in the way, because I really think this shapes a lot of the messaging and how people are receptive to listening to a conversation. But do you find any inconsistency in the way that, look, people in Vietnam, people in Asia know about George Floyd. People in Asia do not know about the young man in Memphis. Clearly, there was a racial component there, or at least the media ran with a racial component. How do you feel about that? I mean, clearly, we didn't have all kinds of, call them riots or uprisings when the young man died in Memphis at the hands of the police. How do you see that? Because to me, it seems like somebody in the media powerhouse has really decided at that moment, let's press on the George Floyd issue, but then other issues don't get pressed on. Then I think when that happens, the trust breaks on any conversation.
It's certainly a complicated thing. I think the reality is that there are often flashpoints related to social issues in society. It is going to be the case that the George Floyd murder or the Rodney King beatings or Emmett Till or any of a number of specific events are going to have this flashpoint character to them. I don't necessarily think that that is the media's fault necessarily. One of the things I'm familiar with, because I work deeply in the racial justice realm, is that social movements have been organizing toward more justice related to the police for a long time. More recently, that comes out of Ferguson and Black Lives Matter. Trump's election was very activating for many folks in communities of color. There was Charlottesville. There were these various build-up events. One could potentially argue that by bringing so much attention to George Floyd, that the media was actually capturing a flashpoint that was very much present in a wide swath of America, that I know many folks in communities of color that were very much activated by that event to an unusual degree. And it doesn't mean that they care any less about any other forms of brutality. Sometimes the kettle overflows at a certain moment. That's my sense of what happened in 2020.
Fair enough. I think you bring up some interesting situations with Ferguson, Emmett Till, George Floyd, Rodney King, all high-profile situations. I think the thing that becomes interesting, and clearly I'm a white guy, but I'm not shy or embarrassed about looking at gross statistics and numbers. The thing that I find a little frustrating, and I'm sure other people find it frustrating too, and clearly I'm not attempting to address all of racial America going back to the dawn of slavery. That's not my point. At least going back in the last 50 or 60 years, even before the Great Society, Black crime, Black violence has been not good. To this day, I don't know how many Americans understand that probably it's right around 3% of the American population is responsible for 60% of the murders. Those are FBI stats. That's the part sometimes that I think there's a disconnect where it's like, okay, I get your point. You say, hey, people are frustrated. These events happen. The media runs with it. It's a flashpoint. But then on the other side of the aisle, people are saying, well, hold on. the gross crime statistics, why are those not addressed? How do you see that?
The way I see it is that goes back a little bit to what I mentioned about poverty earlier, is that crime is concentrated in areas where there's high poverty. And one of the things that's generally different about being a Black person in poverty in this country is that usually it's the case if you're a Black person in poverty, most of your neighbors are poor. That's a lot less likely to be the case if you're a white person in poverty. That obviously there's exceptions, like certain neighborhoods, communities in Appalachia, for example. The data shows pretty clearly, as I understand it, that any area where poverty is concentrated, crime is also concentrated. Some of that is due to the pure desperation of those places, but also some of it is due to a greater desire to police those areas. There's a perception that there's a need for more policing, and if there's more policing, then you uncover more crime. I know lots of folks growing up, teenagers who drank alcohol and did drugs and so forth. None of us were ever policed for those kind of behaviors. There really is something to be said for what policing looks like in high poverty communities. And in America, high poverty communities are predominantly people of color experience. I really do believe that if we were able to take on poverty directly, and not just poverty in a general sense, but concentrated poverty, as Bill Wilson describes it, communities where 40% or more of the population live in poverty, I think we could really move the needle on those crime statistics that, as you pointed out, impact communities of color in addition to white folks in some cases.
Let me take it back in time. Obviously, the 1960s were a flashpoint, the whole decade, essentially. 2 Kennedys killed, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King. I mean, this was a mess of a decade. But at the end of the decade, a lot of people disagree, but a lot of people thought that there was progress, and they thought that LBJ's Great Society was progress. And then since then, I don't know what the exact amount of money that has been spent, but a lot of money has been spent since, let's say, 1968. Here you are, you've got a mission, your point, your generation. You've looked at the situation, you've said, well, everything America's done so far has not been enough. We could look at the gross statistics and we could say, okay, crime statistics, not good. We could say the education statistics, not good, at least in Black communities so far. Well, how do we judge something like the Great Society now? Because if you, Garrett, are coming along with the idea of like, look, we need to do this, are we accepting that what we started in the late 60s has failed? Where are we?
It's very complicated. Part of why it's complicated is that issues of race and class are tangled, that until the 60s, race was class. I'm often asked, oh, is it more of a race issue or a class issue? Until the 60s, those were the same thing. Since then, they've been pulled apart a little bit, but not a lot. There's a lot of complexity there about how all of these issues are tangled. I think if I go back a little bit further than you did and go to the 1920s Gilded Age period, that was an era where there was extreme wealth inequality in this country, a lot of worker exploitation. My great-grandfather, who immigrated from the Russia-Ukraine area, that he worked in the steel mills as a 12-year-old. Folks like Andrew Carnegie exploiting folks like my ancestors to make an extra buck and accumulate what in today's dollars would be hundreds of billions of dollars along the lines of Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Elon Musk.
My family's similar situation. I think it was my great-grandfather coming from Lithuania in the early 1900s, straight to the coal mills in Scranton, Pennsylvania. And the next generation of kids were doctors and engineers. What was it about your family that went from the 12-year-old male ancestor in the steel mills, obviously not a good situation, but there was some resilience. There was something that allowed them to pull out of it.
There was an extraordinary resilience on their part. One of the things I learned about them was that they went across the country, basically setting up shop in different cities where they would open a small store, make enough money to move to the next place. And that's basically how they came west from Ohio, where my great-grandfather worked in the steel mills, to Los Angeles, where that same man ended up buying a pickle plant that was a successful family business that led to family real estate. That was my family's ticket to the white upper middle class.
Why do we not see enough of that bootstrapping mentality? For example, okay, I grew up in the DC area. Baltimore is really close. And I just binge watched The Wire again. Great show. You watch The Wire and you say to yourself, and especially for a lot of American cities these days, the big ones especially, often they're getting the same amount of money for the students as suburban schools. They're getting huge amounts of money. Often the leaders, many times Black leaders, Black police chiefs, Black city councils. What is falling down here if I contrast to your family and the great-grandfather, 12 years old in the steel mill and the bootstrap? It seems like something's missing here beyond, and I'm going to let you address the idea of why you think it's purely a money issue. But I guess you can hear in my voice also, it feels like that there's some type of behavioral point going on here as well.
The behavioral point is really tricky to talk about because it's so often weaponized. Before the civil rights movement, the norm in America and white America was to say that Black folks were genetically inferior. The Holocaust made the eugenics concept uncouth to talk about. After the Holocaust and the civil rights movement, the narrative really shifted to the cultural inferiority of communities of color in this country. And the way I've thought about it is I think about a game of Monopoly. Do you play Monopoly, or have you played Monopoly?
Yeah, I did as a kid, Monopoly and Risk.
Monopoly in this country, the typical white family has 10 times the wealth of the typical Black family. You could imagine that being the money you start with at the beginning of the game. And then white folks earn about 50% more. So you could imagine white folks getting more money every time they pass go. If your family lived in this country for generations and every single generation had the same experience of starting the game with less money, getting less money when they pass go, and the people, quote, winning the game telling you that it was a fair and level playing field, you're going to pass down stories to the generations and say, hey, you know what? This is BS. This is not true for our community. Part of what made that bootstrapping narrative possible in my family is this notion that bootstrapping would work. If you spent a dozen generations in this country with slavery and sharecropping and poverty, why would you give that a shot, frankly? And human beings are resilient. We have folks like Harriet Tubman, who fought her way literally out of slavery, a entrenched, vicious system. It's not a matter of lack of resilience as I see it. It's more about how much faith is there that if I put effort in, I'm going to get rewards for that effort. And it has always been the case in this country that hard work and resilience has the potential to generate intergenerational wealth for some Americans and not others. For families like mine that benefited from that, we continue to believe in that to a large degree. But for families who never had that experience across generations and generations, where that experience begins on a slave ship, I really think it's unrealistic for people to have that kind of hope that the playing field is, quote, level or even level enough.
Now, I think I would have some people out there, as you bring up the mental image of the slave ship, which is not an image anybody really wants to imagine being a part of. But we all know that slavery was not uniquely American. And we know that across the globe, at various points in time, we've had a lot of bad situations. And I'll share with you, I happen to be living in the middle of one of those bad situations. It's fantastic today. Back in the day, back during the Vietnam War, America wasn't very friendly to this nice Southeast Asian country. And I bring that up because I want to expand the conversation a little bit, because I think sometimes it might help when America gets into only discussing Black and white. Like I said, I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. The best high school in the area was turned into a magnet school in the D.C. area in the 1980s called Thomas Jefferson in Falls Church, Annandale, Virginia. You basically took the test in 8th grade. If you got in, I didn't take the test. I didn't get in. You ran that experiment for 30 years. It was a purely merit test. And so the kids that got into, quote, TJ, which often, like you, became the kids going to Stanford and Harvard and all that, the demographics at the end of 30 years was 75% Asian. And of course, we've all heard about I think it's an ongoing suit against Harvard when it comes to discrimination against Asians. About a year ago, Thomas Jefferson administrators, Fairfax County, where I grew up, they decided that they didn't like that distribution, that the best high school in America is 75% Asian students. So they've changed it to leave the situation where we are focusing on merit, at least something we can judge. And hey, look, if the only kids that could get the highest scores to get into Harvard were all Asian, I could care less. If they were all black, I could care less. If they were all white, I could care less. How do you view that? Because I think it's really interesting when you start to look at the Asian insertion into the American conversation. It's kind of like the topic that no one talks about, but these kids just keep rocking and rolling. You know as well as I do, they're not necessarily all coming from super wealth. And of course, Vietnam was flat on its back and other countries in Asia were flat on its back. Speak to me about this issue. I'm sure you've thought about it.
Absolutely. A foundational point for me is that I believe that rich white men define what merit is. That definition of merit has shifted over the past century. I come from a Jewish American family. The Jewish American immigrant experience is similar in many ways to the Asian American immigrant experience today. There was a whole process within Ivy League universities as they were finding that many Jewish students were scoring well on the SATs and so forth and starting to take up more and more slots at Ivy League universities. There was a process to lessen the number of Jewish students that were admitted and prioritize other students. And I think what's important about this narrative is that for the most powerful families in American society, the system always evolves in a way that it continues to work for them.
Can I keep you at the Asian part for a second, though?
Yeah.
I'm talking about the Asian immigrants that don't often have a lot of money. We could be talking Korean grocery stores in LA and stuff like that. And these kids are just hustle, 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 hustle. And overall, look, I've been in Asia for 10 years. Hustle, hustle, hustle. I mean, Vietnam was flat on its back. Hustle, hustle, hustle. A handful of decades later, it's building 100-story towers. How do we address this? Because I hear your point. You say, okay, Mike, the merit exam to get into TJ was designed by white administrators. That's probably true. If they designed it and 30 years into the experiment, it's 75% Asian students, it's like the old Patton speech, the best marble shooter, whatever. But if you did the merit experiment for this number one high school in America, and it came out 75% Asian students, and at the end of 30 years, they don't like that distribution, the current round of administrators, and they change it to something subjective to knock down the Asian population in that particular school, not unlike what you just said with knocking down the Jewish representation in Ivy League schools. That can't make you feel good, can it?
I think what I wanted to get to by bringing wealthy white families back into this is this notion that we're going to eliminate affirmative action for people of color, and we're going to keep legacy admissions for a predominantly wealthy white population. That's the dialogue I don't hear in the discussion about unfairness in college admissions. I hear very little about legacy admissions. Johns Hopkins eliminated it, so there's a precedent for that. But by and large, there is an extra preference given for legacies.
There's no disagreement from me. If there is some type of legacy system that allows a subpar student to get into Harvard because granddad donated $100 million, I don't like that system either. I think we agree there.
Yeah, so the way I see it is if we look at trying to foster a system that offers equal opportunity, that if wealthy white families are hoarding an extreme amount of those opportunities, then everybody who's left is going to be fighting over the remaining opportunities that there are. I have nothing but good things to say about Asian American immigrants who work hard and hustle to get in programs like the one that you mentioned. What I would emphasize is that there's also many Black and brown students who are overlooked for those opportunities as well. And so what does it look like to actually build a merit-based system that offers equal opportunity? Because we're just not even close to that overall.
The educational statistics are pretty stark when you start to compare different groups in America. And the Asian kids overall, I'll use a term of art, the Asian kids are ass kickers when it comes to gaining high scores. And essentially, I will say maybe that's the result of millions of tiger moms, I guess. Would you be comfortable with the idea? I would be. I'll just share with you. But if across America, our best universities, the best high schools, if it was ultimately a merit thing where, okay, you take the test and you get the scores and you get in, old school merit, here's calculus, here's reading and writing, these kinds of things that you can truly measure, engineering, whatever. If it ended up being a distribution of 80% Asian kids at Harvard, would you care? I wouldn't care.
It's a good question. And I think there's a couple things I want to bring up that are context for this. So, one is that the Asian American community, as you know, is particularly given where you live, is not a monolith. There's many different subgroups within the Asian American community who have very different experiences. For example, the Indian American community has the highest median earnings among Asian subgroups. Burmese Americans are the lowest. It's really hard to tease out all of those differences, but one of the factors that I think is pretty clear is that the socioeconomic status, the ties to the elite in those countries are very, very different for Indian American immigrants versus Burmese American immigrants who are primarily coming basically to escape violence. Burmese Americans are just as likely to live in poverty as Black Americans. It really isn't all Asian Americans are succeeding in the ways that the overall data suggests. That it's actually the case that it's really particular subgroups that have some particular advantages that are thriving. That thriving at the educational level doesn't necessarily translate to access to wealth and power in this country. Asian Americans on the whole are actually the least likely to become CEOs, to climb the executive ranks, elected office, and so forth. There's this sub hierarchy that emerges where you have large numbers of high achieving Asian American immigrants who get into schools like TJ, but when you look at who's running Goldman Sachs or McKinsey and Company, you see very few Asian American folks at the top of that list. The way I see that is that for many Asian Americans, they're kind of stuck in the middle of this hierarchy, that they're able to reach the middle class, maybe the upper middle class, like what we might define as the American dream. But when it comes to who really has access to wealth and power, it is rich white men, the same folks who have, for the most part, always had power in this country.
Let me take it to reparations in terms of explaining to people how you would envision this unfolding. I brought up earlier the Great Society, and of course, a lot of money has been spent trying to bring Black America up. I don't know that you said this. My assumption would be that it's not enough from your perspective. We described the situation, we try to describe the landscape in this conversation, and there's a lot of problems. And of course, we've discussed education, we've discussed crime, there's other issues, family structure. So many Black kids come from a one-parent family. All the psychological and sociological work has been done. Everyone knows that a two-parent family overall, broad statistics, is a much better situation for a young kid coming up. When I start to think about the idea, if I even entertain the idea of reparations, how does it unfold? People are given money. It feels like a lottery to me. I guess that's where I'm ultimately going, is it feels like a lottery, whether it's professional sports or lottery winners. It seems like also there's a vast amount of data that shows generally what happens when people are awarded big sums of money. And that also carries with it issues and potential problems. Maybe you can explain how you envision reparations unfolding.
First of all, I think one of the things that I would say about reparations is that I think of reparations as this country offering a new social contract to Black and Indigenous Americans. Yes, there will need to be a financial component to that, but reparations is about so much more than the financial aspects. That what does it look like for this country to apologize for its past and commit to not repeating that past, either in a very direct way or in an indirect way, that this country has found ways to make it difficult for Black Americans to generate wealth and access the American dream in this country since the 60s as well. What does it look like to put out that new social contract and say, we're really sorry, we're going to do this differently going forward, and we're going to make sure that every American, including Black and Indigenous Americans, has the opportunity to succeed, to thrive, to have their basic needs met, and so forth. That social contract is really, really important. Many people would say that's what distinguishes the United States, in theory, from old Europe, for example, like where there wasn't that social contract where if you work hard, you're resilient, you're rewarded for it. And I think part of why the financial piece is so important is that America is a capitalist country. In a capitalist system, if you start life with more capital, you're going to be advantaged. And there really isn't anything we can do about that if we stay within a capitalist system, because if we made some effort to level off everybody's capital at each generation, then it wouldn't be capitalism anymore. There's baked in inequality into the capitalist system in America that distribution of capital is racialized. As I mentioned, the typical white family has about 10 times as much wealth as the typical Black family. That's similar for indigenous families.
How do you break that down? How do you attribute the difference in wealth? It's strictly only what you might refer to as America's racism is the only and primary reason? I mean, I brought up the behavior part earlier in terms of each individual, and here I am again in Asia, each individual has to wake up every day and make a decision. Then they have to make another decision. They have to make another decision. It does seem like we can find examples, again, why I brought up the many Asian folks today, whether they stay in America or whether they're from another country and they go back to their home country. How do we get to a place, though, where I guess the way I see it is you're putting on the table like, hey, I think that money can solve this. And then other people might say, well, hold on. If behavior is also a component or is left off the table, it seems difficult. It seems difficult. And I will also add, too, that I think what seems difficult to me, for example, I have nephews that are freshmen and junior in college. They're just kids that grew up in the suburbs. It does seem like, where do we draw the line? Like, who's responsible? Who's responsible? Because all of the people that were directly affected are no longer alive, and the people that caused the problems are no longer alive. You might argue, okay, there's some super high net worth, wealthy white guys that have got a lot of money and a lot of power and a lot of control. But I guess this is ultimately probably where the rubber meets the road in terms of the conversation, in terms of how is behavior measured? Will money solve the problem? Who's responsible? Is the 3-year-old kid today who's in preschool, the 3-year-old white kid today in preschool, should he be waking up to the idea that he'll have a financial burden for the 3-year-old kid that's sitting next to him that might happen to be Black in the preschool? Is that the line we're ultimately drawing?
One of the things I talk about a lot in the book is this notion of experimentation. One of the things that I believe about reparations, I do believe that ultimately the federal government has a responsibility to provide reparations, and that very much is in line with how the United Nations talks about situations where reparations are needed. The United States very much fits that description. But I think it's also the case that this country can engage in experimentation to explore the exact questions that you're talking about. By experimentation, I mean, what does it look like to provide a reparations program in a city or a community or in a state? Some of those efforts are starting to happen in places like Evanston, where cash is starting to move to those who have been impacted in different ways by systemic racism. We can run these experiments and learn from them, tweak them, and eventually scale them. In a country where wealth inequality is so extreme, there's just a lot of capacity to try some of that experimentation. I mentioned Larry Page earlier, being able to fund an endowment to provide a guaranteed income for everyone in poverty in San Francisco. His co-founder, Sergey Brin, could provide $1 million in reparations to all the Black folks in San Francisco and still have billions of dollars left over. Larry could fund the guaranteed income. Sergey could fund the reparations. We could study all of that, evaluate all of that, and see what works and see what didn't, and try to do better instead of saying, well, it's a long time ago, there's nothing we can do about it.
Yeah, so this brings up an interesting issue. Colonial powers in Africa, European colonial powers in Africa. I would assume conceptually, if you want to put the responsibility on America for its slavery of Black Africans, that you would also see, I know this is not your responsibility, you've not written a book about this, but conceptually, I would assume you would agree, if I follow your logic, that the European powers should be held responsible for Africa today, based on their past colonial efforts.
Oh, absolutely. America is a colonial power. Many of the European nations are colonial powers. And if you look at how wealth is distributed globally, the racial wealth gaps that exist across continents really look almost the same as the racial wealth gaps that exist in the United States. For example, Africa has about 17% of the global population, similar to the size of North America. I believe the latest numbers are Africa holds 1 or 2% of global wealth. So it really is the case that 10-to-1 racial wealth gap exists globally because of European colonization in ways that are pretty similar to American colonization and exploitative practices.
Would you also take it to the Middle East? Because the Middle East was heavily involved in Black slavery, the importing of Black citizens for slavery in the Middle East. I guess ultimately, this would be the point that, and maybe this is a whole different conversation, where do we draw the line on all these issues? Because if we start to go down, at least from my perspective, we start to go down this particular group, bad things happen. And this particular group, bad things happen. And this particular country did this at this point in time. It does seem like we can start to go back over time. Somebody could say, well, hold on, Japan was doing a lot of XYZ in World War II. It does seem like if we start to go down this path, that are we trying to clean up history everywhere? Or are we just going to clean up history in certain places? It is messy and complicated, I get it. But for me, especially being a white American male who lives in Asia as a minority, to see the hustle and bustle and the resilience of the place that I happen to be in, and to bring up all the issues that we've talked about today, it seems very complicated to pick any particular issue. Shoot, somebody could say, America kept women down for a long time, XYZ, not being able to having the right to vote and stuff. So it does seem like this particular issue of trying to resolve history, it's tough.
It's very tough. And I think one of the things I would say about reparations is that while reparations looks at the past, it's ultimately a forward-looking policy. The way I think about it is like, what does it look like to build a country and world where everybody has their basic needs met and the ability to thrive? And it is the case that historically, colonization, slavery, and other atrocities plays a major role in whose basic needs are being met today and whose aren't. Yes, there's a past component to it, but I think ultimately it's about what does it look like to build a society where everyone has their needs met and can thrive? What does it look like to have a social contract where going forward, people feel like in a consistent way that if I put in effort, if I overcome adversity, I'm resilient, I'm going to be rewarded for that. It just is not the case for communities of color in America and lots of places around the globe. That if you look at total global wealth, this gets back to the 2 million point, total global wealth is about 400 trillion. If you divide that out per capita, it's about 50,000. That's 200,000 for a family of 4. For every family that has 2 million in wealth, there's another 10 or so families that have none. Society where there's high inequality, it really is going to be the case that at least the way we've engineered our world and what innovation has currently offered, most people are going to have close to zero. If most people have close to zero, it's going to be very challenging for there to be social mobility that gives people confidence and trust that if they invest fully in the system, they'll get the results they're hoping for. And people are dogged and resilient, so they'll do their best to figure it out, in many cases, regardless of how the system is structured. But why not build a more fair and just system that really motivates people to invest fully and give it their best shot instead of falling into potentially hopelessness about whether they really could have the life they deserve?
The book, Rich White Men, What It Takes to Uproot the Old Boys Club and Transform America. What you just said in the last minute, though, is very complicated to achieve. Ultimately, there's been many forms of government in the last few centuries, and a lot of people might imagine that what you described in very plain-sounding, pragmatic language could involve a magic hand or people making decisions from the top, and less about anything that might resemble democracy. These days, I'm not so sure what America resembles exactly. That's a whole different topic. But I think that's probably the most complicated part about what you bring up, is that once we go down this path, it's not easy. It's not easy. There's going to be a lot of conflict. You might have people that want to go to wars over what you're bringing up. That.
This is conflict-driven work. There's always been conflict over resources in this country and around the world. There's also been conflict when resources get very unequal. That's where a lot of revolutions ultimately stem from. When I think about this work, a lot of it is about what does it take to build an America that actually lasts and continues to grow economically, that has a strong democracy. We have many voices in our democracy that are marginalized and invisibilized in the current structure. For example, the vast majority of Black Americans support reparations. When we look toward building a democratic society,
You said the vast majority do support.
of Black Americans do support reparations.
But just on a basic level, I think if any group of people were told, hey, you might get a check, I mean, most people are going to say, sure, I'll take that.
Sure. I guess what I'm trying to say is that if we listen to the communities that are impacted by injustices and amplify their viewpoints, I think we have a better shot at getting to just policies than if we ignore those voices. Maybe it's reparations, maybe it's not. But I think if we listen seriously to those voices about what they feel like they need to succeed in this country, I think that will get us a lot further than setting those voices aside like we largely have historically.
Ultimately, you lay out many issues. I try to bring up other issues. America is one great competition. I think that much we can agree on is that it is going to be a competition to see what happens. Maybe there'll be some fights and some disagreements and some agreements and some conflicts, but it's going to be a competition as things move forward. Garrett, I appreciate you taking some time today. Hey, where would you like to send people to? The book on Amazon, all that kind of fun stuff. Is there a website you would like to direct people to?
Yeah, that you can direct folks to GarrettNeiman.com, GarrettNeiman. That's my author website that will have links to order the book and also other resources for folks who are interested in this topic.
Garrett, nice stuff. I hope you enjoyed the conversation.
I did. Thank you so much for the time. I appreciate you engaging and wading into controversial territory that I certainly don't believe that I'm right about everything or have all the answers, that this is really about us exploring together to try to get there. And I appreciate you playing a role in helping us do that as a society.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, Trend Following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.